Ding.
All right, so Walter, thank you for joining us on our YouTube series, Let's Talk Marketing, but first, Vika. You are in the US, but you work for a Swedish company, Funnel. Do you know what Fika is? Have you ever Fika'd before?
Yes, we actually just had our first official office fika last Friday.
Nice. Oh yeah, I saw
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Nice. Was it good? Did it live up to the standards?
I think that it did. We all got together in the kitchen and we had some really lovely Swedish baked goods with names that I can't pronounce. And but I checked for authenticity and I was told that they were the real deal. So
Okay.
it
Okay.
was nice. We all got to chat, and I think the point is kind of to slow down and take a little break and just talk, which we
Mm.
got to do. And so on that basis, it was really nice.
Yeah, it is nice. I think like Amanda and I, like on the team, I'm just gonna switch up the way. Oh, and now I'm getting a phone call. One second, it's my dog walker. Seemed like an accident, but I think we're okay.
Are you
So,
sure?
yeah,
Okay.
he said absolutely nothing when I answered. I was like, hello, hello. And it just sounded like a lot of pocket noise. So I think
Ah, oh, I see. That kind of accident.
that kind of accident,
Got
yeah.
it. Not a
Um,
dog accident.
not a dog accident. I mean, much more. Now we're finally on. Okay. I will. I don't know if I'm going to edit that out or just keep in some dog walkers.
Hey,
Okay.
that's real life, We live in real life, so.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, awesome. But so, Walter, tell us about what you do, not only at Funnel, but as a lecturer.
Yeah, sure. So at Funnel, I'm head of data operations for the US team. And the short version of what we do is we help folks get idiosyncratic data sets into Funnel. So we have a lot of out of the box standard connectors. We have like hundreds of them, and they're supported by dev teams, and they work really well, and they cover the vast majority of use cases for those particular platforms. But every once in a while, our customers, users will need something a little different, maybe their own, home rolled data warehouse or some very particular custom reports that they have in a particular platform that maybe we don't support, something maybe a little exotic or a little different. And so anyone who needs to pipe that type of data into Funnel, they come to my team. And so we help, work with the customer to understand, where the data lives and what it looks like. And then, we work on getting it in, building software or whatever tools we need to do that. And then check with the customer, make sure it is what they had expected, and then it's shipped. So that's sort of the short version. Um, there are, let's see, almost, we're in the teens now, and we're growing because um, as the product grows and the product gets, wider and deeper on particular platforms, there's new platforms every day, and
Mm.
this is tech, so things are always changing and growing, and so the need for us, our customer needs are becoming more complex for these types of things, and there's, between the new platforms and the complexity, my team is growing in order to service these. Yeah, so that's what I'm doing here. And at Northeastern, I'm a lecturer at Northeastern University. I teach in the Enterprise Intelligence program. We have a professional program for, sort of for working professionals. It's at the master's level, and so I teach data visualization and communication to the master's level enterprise intelligence students.
Nice. And so you're gonna talk a little bit about that today, which we all need a little bit of help with our data visualization at times.
Yes, there is no such thing as perfect, but we can all strive to get better. So
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely get better. So, but first of all, let's feature your fika. So, what do you got for us?
so I've got coffee with milk. I'm a fan. I'm a dark roast guy. So
Okay, all right.
I like the deep caramel flavors. And I've got oatmeal cookies. My wife makes really good oatmeal cookies, and I'm not a big sweets person, but I think the oatmeal is a nice balance. So
Oh,
nice soft
great.
texture, not too much sugar. Yeah, I'm a
Right.
fan.
Do did you put the raisins in them?
Sometimes other dried fruits like currants and I don't know, whatever is kind of
Mm,
looking interesting. But I
yeah.
also like the regular old ones too.
Yeah. And then like mine is like, so I have all my allergies. So I have walnuts today,
Mm, mhm.
which is not as exciting. I need to go to like these like raw food vegan place because I can't eat like gluten, wheat, or gluten, soy, or lactose. So it's
Ah,
like basically most fun stuff. There is a place in Stockholm that has really great fikas that I can actually eat. So I always get super excited when I
mm,
go. I should have sourced one today, but I was
ah.
I was
I
lazy.
understand how you feel. I can't eat gluten either. These are gluten-free oats.
Right.
So,
And you know, I forgot about the oatmeal cookie because like it is my favorite. And if you do it, it can be gluten free. So that's
yeah,
just like, yeah.
for sure.
Oh, love it. Awesome. Okay. So let's get into the topic today. We are gonna obviously start talking about some graphs. So why is it? I feel like I have this problem so all the time. Why is it so hard to make graphs look good?
I think there's a lot of reasons, but there's probably some more substantial and more common ones,
Mm,
and we can run through them. The first, I think, is often we're trying to do too much with the data graphic itself. And that can mean a lot of different things. So to be more specific, often there's too much data.
mm,
There's and there's too many graphical elements. So there's something to be said for trying to keep it simple, um,
mm,
and that can mean a lot of different things. So specifically, like visual elements on the page, if you grab your statistical software or your dashboarding software or whatever software you're using to generate your graphics, often um, they often create a lot of visual artifacts that are not useful. Really, they're just pixels and they don't really add.
mm, mm,
And so learning how to get rid of those pixels is kind of an art, and sort of separates the folks who are sort of a little bit new to thinking about visualization design from sort of the experts and the veterans. The veterans have learned how to get all that stuff that's not necessary out of the graphic.
mm,
So very common to grab Excel and put some data in and click a button, and then of course you have this, whatever chart it is, and then you have this big legend, and your legend, is a series labels and then maybe a little square with some color. That takes up a lot of visual space, and actually even a little bit of thoughtful design can take that totally out of the graphic while retaining the meaning for the audience. And it's also, do you need all those years in your time series plot? Do you need them all?
oh,
Probably not. Your first pass, you put your data into your software, and then a graphic comes out. Do you need all that data? And also, if you need it for for its truth value, maybe you can also de-emphasize it. Right, so you can still have it for its truth value, but find a way to de-emphasize it visually so that the graphic itself becomes easier to look at. It's less visually and cognitively burdensome. So there's
mm,
a win there, and that's another sort of subtlety. And I'm sure we'll come back to that point later. But just generally, do you need all of the data in the graphic? Can you find a way to remove visual elements that are not particularly useful but take up a lot of space? Excel, for example, it tends to put boxes around everything. It loves enclosures, and those enclosures almost never are useful. It puts all these lines, these like
mm,
horizontal lines across plots, almost never really useful. Just add pixels, add visual burden, add cognitive burden, but they don't do anything. So you can
mm,
usually get rid of those. That kind of clean design that folks tend to expect from professional graphics is arrived at through the thoughtful removal of all of this stuff.
mm,
Tick marks, decimal places, things that are just not necessary often. I think another thing that happens, other than the decluttering and the having too much, is the design itself is too much, is trying to convey too many things at the same time. So, a particularly challenging design is the stacked bar chart. Folks tend to, they have this matrix of data in their software, and they create a stacked bar because they want to show, for example, if it's an absolute valued stacked bar, it'll show some headline value at the top of the bars. But then there's also individual series that add up to that total, and that's a lot visually. There's a
mm,
lot going on there, and so if you need to ask yourself, what am I trying to show? Am I more concerned with the headline numbers, how those are changing, or am I more concerned with how the shares of the whole are changing? So when you try to tell a story with both of those at the same time, you end up with a graphic that's just more dense. And often it's better to start to break those types of things up,
Hmm.
because they tend to be too much. You end up with an audience who's spending a lot of time looking at your graphic, trying to digest it. And what they're not really going to do is they're not going to say, oh, this is taking me a long time to digest. They're just going to think, oh, this is kind of not really nice to look at. And I'm not interested, and I'm going to turn off.
Yeah.
That's a thing. That's a real thing. And I mean, of course, it does depend on your audience and sort of how sophisticated they are at consuming data graphics. But it happens. And so the more professional designs and cleaner designs tend to be simpler and a little bit more thoughtful about how dense the information is shown there. I think the last thing, and this is a little bit, this is that same theme, but a little bit more broadly, is often the approach that folks tend to take when they make data graphics is they do this bottom-up approach where they have some data and then they put it into the software and then they click the button. They click the pie chart button, or they click the bar chart button, etc. And I think that's the easy way to do it, but it's not necessarily going to lead to the most thoughtful way to show the data. And so the opposite way would be, before you do that, think of a design beforehand that is sort of more aligned with the point you're trying to make. So
Mm.
try to come top down. So if you come from top down, you may arrive at a different design choice, and one that might be cleaner, it might be simpler.
Yeah, and then like I think we talked a little bit before, but like what does it mean to like be effective really?
Sure.
Yeah, like because I think a lot of people think they're being effective, but in reality they're doing all those things like you said, they're just adding that cognitive burden, they're just adding all of these extra layers that aren't really telling the right story.
Right. So I think to be effective, it's necessary but not sufficient to show data in your data graphic, right? That's the first half of the battle. The second half is being able to get your audience to understand your unique point of view and be able to take action, or at least arrive at this sort of narrative or specific point you're trying to make.
Mm,
So you have to there's a little bit of a bridge there, and if you can't, you sort of get halfway there, you're not being effective. And I think that being able to drive the action is the sort of the standard we should take for our graphics effective. So it sort of would be, can my audience recall and retell at least some elements of what I'm showing them and the point I'm trying to make,
mm, mm,
right? It's sort of not even enough that they just perceive. They need to be able to internalize it enough that they can do something with it. They
mm,
can understand your point of view and then take an action or appreciate the prescription you've made or something.
mm,
So it's the communication element that's important. It's not just sort of the graphic. Um, I think coming from both in sort of an academic background and a background where being editorial and trying to be persuasive with graphics has to be done very carefully. Um, Unless you're in that realm, you can be editorial and you can be very sort of thoughtful with your approach to bring a narrative or be persuasive with your graphics. You can be editorial. You have that room usually.
mm. And that kind of like leads us into the next question. So like I like that idea, like they need to take something away from it, right? Like it's not just something that they look at for that moment, but like they need to take action on it. They need to remember it for in some way. So I mean, can you tell us why it's so important to be able to tell a story with your data and expand on what we really mean by telling a story with your data? Not like, we're just saying, how do we manipulate it to tell the story we want, but like, what do we really mean by that and why it's so crucial?
Right. So the value of the data story is again in that communication component, and it's in your audience's ability to recall what you've shown them and then take action. And the effectiveness of the data story is when we start to draw on our human characteristics, right? We're not necessarily very good at recalling cold, hard data.
Mm,
That's not what we're built for, right? We're built as emotional creatures. And so having a data story, and especially one that sort of has an emotional content in some form, and it can, and it doesn't just mean, it has to be like a sad or especially
Mm,
happy. I mean sort of like helping someone understand what the stakes are for them. Like, why do I
mm,
care about this thing, right? So if you can introduce the idea of the stake to the person, right, that's very effective. And then you can build that into your data story. I mean, I think the simplest way to think of the data story from an information and graphic design perspective here, it would be sort of like the 3-act play, right? So if I'm building a data story and I think of the 3-act play, it's going to be something like, I'm going to introduce my cast of characters. Here's the context, and then the messy middle, right? That's where the hero goes on his journey and does
mm,
whatever, is introduced to the bad guy. And, that's the narrative version. But for us, it's going to be, here's the opportunity, or the opportunities, or here's the problem that we need to solve, and then the closure, right? The third act is where the good guy beats the bad guy, right? Or a good girl beats the bad girl, or whomever. And that looks like, here is our solution to this problem. Here's our path forward. Here's my unique point of view on where we go next, right? So that's sort of it.
mm,
And so the story makes us more effective communicating.
mm.
That's sort of the point, right? The opposite would be if just, here's a deck of cold hard facts, and I'm not going to sell you why you should care or have the stakes. And you're going to come away with, well, I just saw a bunch of information, but I'm not invested in it. Right? So that would
Mm.
be sort of the failure and the lack of the story.
Yeah, I mean, like, we have to remember that we're super emotional creatures, and like, and you're at the end of the day, like you said, you're trying to convince someone of like where you want to go and why. So,
Yep.
yeah, great point. I like the 3-act play analogy. It makes it very tangible. So, thank you for that. And then so let's get down to some ways people can improve. So, like, what can people do to improve? Like, what are maybe your top 5 things that you would recommend people to do, whether it's like, with design skills or something like that?
Yeah. So I have I'll do my best to stick to 5.
If you have
I
more, I'm sure people will appreciate more. So go for more.
yeah, yeah, sure. So off the top of my head, I had introduced this idea before of, the top-down approach to the design as opposed to the bottom up, which is where I've got my data and my software and I click the button. I like to, before I've made my graphics, I like to sketch. I just grab a pen. I'm not an artist, but I like to doodle and I like to draw different types of charts related to the themes that I'm going to try to show.
Mm,
And so that sometimes kind of helps me think about my my design choices in a meaningful way. And then it's sort of more holistic. So if I'm going to build a deck or something, I now have thoughts on what types of charts go with what section. And then perhaps if I'm doing a data story, okay, well, maybe this will be good for the messy middle, and this is sort of sandwiched between the beginning and the middle, etc. So, and then I start to have those design ideas, and that can then drive from the top my chart choices, or my whatever design elements I decide I want in my visuals, and
mm,
and textual elements and things like that. Another thing is critique. I think building your design eye. I think there's something to be said for the idea that we're all designers. We just may not have the lexicon and have had the practice and developed our own design eye. And so I encourage people, especially when I'm teaching, I say, hey, look for data graphics out there in nature, in the newspaper, on the internet, even on the walls of the university that we're in. Look at those things and ask yourself if you like them. If so, why do you like them? How are they effective? Like, what's the color? Do you like the color palette? Do you think the color choices were effective? Do you think the visual hierarchies are effective? And so, build your design eye, but by critiquing, including your own work, but not your own, or not only your own work.
mm,
I think strive to be simple. It's probably a good idea to break up those really dense graphics that you're thinking of making, where you're trying to say too much at the same time. Those stacked bar charts, really try to break those up. If you have these sort of grouped bar charts, you've got all these different sort of qualitative groups, and then there's just a lot of data and a lot of color and a lot of pixels on the page. Try to find a way to, think deeply about what you're trying to say in that 1 or 2 sentences, and then realign your graphics to support that. I think another opportunity, especially for folks who haven't really dug into it or thought about it too much, is color, is being thoughtful about color. And so start with color palette. There's going to be choices that may be better than others. And so specifically, like too much color. You can have too much color. Try to be err on the side of minimalism with color if you possibly can. Um, Use desaturated colors. So heavily saturated colors they tend to ask too much of the person looking at them, and they can get into kind of garish territory. So if you use desaturated colors, they usually tend to look nicer with each other. And if you're not good at picking, there's a lot of tools online now that will help you pick a color palette, including a desaturated color palette. I think another thing is grayscaling, and this is where the pros you can really recognize the pros is they will de-emphasize elements on the page that need to be there, but that are not as relevant or not as important for the viewer to see immediately. Your axes labels. If you have, if you like a bar chart 0 to 100% or 0 to a million, it might not be the case that you need those as visually prominent on the page. They're important because they give scale to the axis, but you don't necessarily need them to be 100% saturated black if you're using a black for letters and the typeface and stuff like that. You can de-emphasize those kinds of elements, and then you end up with a graphic that's just easier and nicer to look at. It kind of cleans the design up. So I think using grayscales, using fewer colors, thinking about desaturation is helpful. One other thing is it turns out that a fairly substantial amount of the male human population is color weak, and color weak meaning what I think a lot of folks think of as color blind. So color weakness means that there's an issue with their ability to differentiate certain colors when they're proximate, and the most common is red and greens, right?
Yeah.
That would so folks usually would call that red green color weakness. So
Hmm.
if you can, try to avoid using those reds and greens next to each other in your graphics. If
Yeah.
you have to do that, include some other visual cue to help a person with that weakness recognize that there's a different color there, a
Okay.
different hue. If you I mean Sometimes you have branding, right? Your brand is like, if you have a Mediterranean color brand, that's real life. Maybe are making branded graphics. So just try to find another visual cue. You can add visual noise. You can do a call out, a leader, or something like that. So that's a good tip for color weakness. I think practicing decluttering is the last tip. Just really, look at your graphics, think deeply about everything. Do I need that tick mark? Do I need that legend? Do I need a subtitle? Can I just get away with a title? Like an action title, a persuasive title that has my point of view.
Mm.
Um, Anytime you can get stuff off the page that's not valuable is usually a win, is a win for the design. So
And
those
that
are
take
those would be my tips.
Yeah, and those are fantastic. I mean, they are things that, like, I wouldn't think of, So, and accessibility is super important, obviously. It's like, so I think those are great tips. And then I would be so sad if I didn't go back. We've talked before about cognitive burden, but
Mm.
for those who don't know what cognitive burden is, that kind of latches onto your last tip. What is cognitive burden?
So probably not a huge surprise. It's just essentially the demands on your audience's mind to process and understand your graphics. And I mean, unlike the written word or non-data graphics, which usually are easy to digest and easy to understand, data graphics require more of your audience. And the idea is, there's some science, some psychologist whose name I can't remember sort of showed that most people can only hold, 5 plus or minus 2 kind of chunks of information in their mind at the same time,
Mm,
right? So let's relate that to data viz. So what that means is, if you have a really complicated design where you have a legend with 12 items with different shapes and different colors, your audience is probably not going to be able to hold all of those different meanings in their head at the same time while they try to digest your graphics. It's just not reasonable.
mm,
And so that idea sort of is where you can inform your design. That's, thinking of cognitive burden. I don't want my audience to have to hold too much information in their head at the same time. Otherwise, I'm going to lose them. And it's not really like there's this, sort of trickle down as cognitive burden goes up of your audience's interest and ability to perceive your visual. It's a cliff. They're going to get frustrated. They're going to get bored. And I'm very guilty of this. I describe this as my lizard brain. I have a very lazy lizard brain, and so if you create graphics that make me think too hard, I just don't want to look at them. I'm just I check out. For most of my life, I thought that was really a bad thing, but it turns out it's actually very useful when looking at graphics because it helps me gut check if something seems too cognitively burdenful.
Yeah.
Other idea of cognitive burden is relates back to that idea of all of the things on the page that don't add, right? This is the idea of the sort of the signal to noise ratio. If there's a lot of stuff that isn't really communicating a point or data or something, that's just more stuff to look at, and it's not that obvious, but all those pixels demand this sort of marginal increase on your viewer. And so getting those out helps them to not have to see those and then to hone in on the thing that is important.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I, like, yeah, having that type of way of, even in product, it's like that they have a whole book like "Don't Make Me Think," right? Like people don't
Yes.
want to have to like think
Yeah.
too hard about anything. So
Yeah.
good to apply that to your graphics as well.
That is literally the line that I use. I have a slide that I show my students usually with a lizard, and this is my lizard brain. He doesn't want to think. He's looking for movement so he can eat the thing flying by him, but he doesn't
Yeah.
want to think about it. And so I usually say that exact line. I say, if you're making me graphics, don't make me think too hard, right?
Yeah.
Better not to have to think, but don't make me think too hard for sure. Yeah.
So I really want to ask you, what are your least favorite types of graphs? Because I feel like we all have them that we don't really feel like communicate best. But what are yours?
Yes. Well, I will say that they're all tools in the toolbox. And so in the same sense that I might not love, a crescent wrench, they're
What do you have
all sort
against
of
crescent
necessary.
wrenches?
Well, nothing in particular, but I think that's my point is there's very few charts that I don't like. I know that there's many folks have all kinds of different opinions about certain types of charts.
Mm.
Pie charts come up all the time. Pie charts are real, they're real life. Your audience recognizes them, they're not going anywhere. So probably time to get over that. I'm not a huge fan of spider charts in particular. Um, they're high dimensional, so there's a lot of data in them, and they're very dense, and they're really inappropriate for anyone who is not a sophisticated consumer of data graphics. Even like
Mm-hmm.
scientists who look at graphics for and need to digest data for academic and research purposes are not even that great at digesting spider charts, right? So there should be sort of kind of up here with the sophistication level, and they're not even that great at them. This is measured empirical fact by data visualization researchers. So not a big fan of spider charts, but in general, radial charts. So radial charts meaning anything that has a center point and for which arc length around that has some particular meaning. There's some data encoding in that. They tend to be pretty, right? They're aesthetically pleasing, but they're often hard to really get a ton of meaning out of.
Mm.
You see them out there in this sort of data art kind of stuff, which is really cool, right? But it's a different purpose often from what we're trying to do as practitioners in the business
Yeah.
environment, trying to persuade someone of something.
Yes.
We're sort of solving a different problem. So radial charts in general, not a big fan. And then a lot of sort of network and graph visualizations are cool looking, and the software that makes them has really been thoughtful to make them cool looking, just
Mm.
not super informative.
Yeah.
Those are not informative often. But yeah, so actually it's kind of a funny story. This a company that I worked at previously, they were a startup, and they were creating a product. Well, we were creating a product for sort of a general population, and we had spider charts in our product. And so one of the first things I did there was say, hey, like we're trying to sell a product to not necessarily sophisticated consumers of data graphics here, but we've got spider charts. We should ask people if they understand them more. And it turns out
Mm.
that they really didn't. And What's funny is the charts themselves were very successful in the marketing of the product to the non-consumers, right? The VCs and
Mm.
the other, folks looking at our tech. But then when it came down to the users, they were just not quite as popular. And so I considered it kind of a victory when I was able to persuade us to not have that in our product anymore. That was a success for me. So
I
anyway,
I mean, I know what you mean when you say spider chart, but yeah, looking at those, I'm just like, it
yeah,
takes
they're
me
a
like
lot.
an hour. Yeah, it's a lot of information.
Yeah, they're a lot.
Um, well, thank you so much for the chat, Walter. And like, I don't know if you heard my dog come in and click, 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 like his little
I
nails
didn't.
on. You didn't? Okay, good.
No.
I'm like, he's like walking around like,
Oh, how
and he's
funny.
like, yeah. So okay, good. You couldn't hear that.
I couldn't.
So thank you so much for the chat. It was, I mean, we've talked a little bit about this, but it was really nice to like speak again. And I know this is a topic that a lot of people are going to find valuable because, a funnel, that's I think the part that a lot of like marketers do struggle with is like, telling an effective story with not so much cognitive burden. And we need to be convincing as marketers. And how do we do that with our graphs is super important. So thank you again.
Yes, thank you. Pleasure.